Now, Israeli-Palestinian activist and author Miko Peled is a contributing writer, published author and human rights activist born in Jerusalem. He joins us now via Zoom from Washington, D.C. in the United States. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program. What is your reaction to what the UN findings are? Is this something that surprised you or what you suspected all along?
Well, thank you for having me on the show. No, there's no surprise there. I think it was obvious from the very beginning that this was a targeted killing. And I think more than that, not only was it a targeted killing, it was obvious that the decision to target Shireen Abu Akleh was not made by a lone soldier on the ground or a commander on the ground. It had to have come from the very top of the chain of command because of who she was, because she was well known. So there could not be any other conclusion other than this was a targeted assassination of a journalist by the Israeli authorities.
All right, so I don't even know where to begin, because these stories of journalists being targeted by Israeli authorities over time is not new, and yet there's hardly ever any kind of sanction. So I suppose we won't expect to see anything happen now.
No, Israel acts with impunity. It's been acting with impunity since it was established. We know now from the Amnesty International report that the state of Israel has been an apartheid regime since 1948, which is pretty much almost the same time that South Africa was officially named an apartheid regime. So there's a parallel there, except that the apartheid in South Africa, thankfully, came down, and the apartheid in Palestine continues, and that is a serious problem. And of course, like you say, Israel acts with impunity. Israel kills children. Israel kills journalists. Israel kills young Palestinians almost on a daily basis. The Palestinian blood is cheaper than a bullet, you know, and it does so with impunity. And the international community has failed, I think, Palestinians through and through by not standing up and not demanding justice and not acting and imposing severe sanctions on the state of Israel as would be expected.
The UN shocked that the Israeli authorities are not carrying out a criminal investigation, which would suggest that this soldier was acting under orders. And we all know that snipers are very skilled at what they do. This could not have been random. This must have been an assassination.
Yes. First of all, she was very well known. She was experienced. She knew exactly where to stand. She wore a bulletproof vest that said press on it. She wore a helmet. The bullet hit her exactly between the bulletproof vest and the helmet. And no sniper, no lone soldier on his own would ever take that kind of responsibility. The order to kill her, or at least an okay to kill her, had to come from the very top, at least the Minister of Defense, if not the Prime Minister himself. This was a big step. This was a serious assassination of not just some kid that nobody will know about, but a well-known, well-respected, and very well-loved journalist that has been reporting on this issue for a very long time. So you're absolutely right. This could not have been a random act. This was not a lone soldier. This was not even the action of a commander on the ground. This had to have come from the very, very top of the chain of command. So this was a targeted assassination, and because it is clear that it had to have come from the very top of the chain of command. Like I said, at least the defense minister, if not the prime minister himself. What's the point of an investigation? They're not going to want to reveal this anyway. So they're not going to investigate, and they never investigate anyway when Palestinians are killed. I mean, Israeli soldiers kill Palestinians all the time, and there's never an investigation, not a serious one anyway.
So where does this leave journalists? Because if the Israeli authorities are targeting journalists, is it to try and get the story untold? But the social media, people are tweeting, they are killing Abu Akleh wasn't going to change anything. So why do it?
Well, I think it's why do powerful, corrupt regimes do the things that they do? They have a sense of power, and I think they like to display it and expose it. And in the case of Israel, because it acts with impunity, because it knows there will be no sanctions, because the international community is weak on this issue, then they do whatever they want to do. I mean, what you saw what happened 2 days later during your funeral. They brutally beat the funeral procession. They brutally beat the pallbearers to a point where the casket fell to the ground. I mean, how much more brutality can one regime display? And this is done in broad daylight in front of the cameras, like you said. But a few days go by, a few weeks go by, people stop talking about it, and then they move on to the next thing. And they know that this is, unless the international community stands, unless people of conscience stand up and demand that their elected officials act, that unless they demand sanctions on Israel, unless they demand that Israeli ambassadors be sent home, unless they call their ambassadors from Tel Aviv, unless they stop. And by the way, these are all recommendations that are in the Amnesty International report, which reported, in case somebody wasn't paying attention, that there is the Israeli state is a state of apartheid. It's an apartheid state since 1948. And there are recommendations how international community, states, and non-state and non-governmental organizations need to act. There are sanctions, all collaboration, all cooperation, all sales of arms, all anything has to do with the defense industry, with defense collaborations, with trade must be brought to a stop, just like was done in South Africa, by the way, to bring down the regime, to bring the regime to its knees so that they collapse and we can replace the apartheid regime in Palestine with a free democratic Palestine. It's the only way. And if we don't step in, nobody will step in. If we don't stand in the midst between the Israeli regime and the journalists and the young Palestinians who are fighting for their lives, who are standing up and trying to just exist, merely exist, and are being killed, unless we do it, nobody's going to do it. And there will continue to be another Shireen Abu Akleh and more Palestinian children. And now there are, horrifying stories about Ahmed Ben Nasra, who was arrested as a boy, and now he's got serious mental health problems, and they're putting him in solitary confinement, and the torture of children in prisons, and on and on and on. They will not stop. And I come from the privileged side of this. I'm like the white South Africans. I'm the Israeli who grew up and lived on the privileged side of the apartheid regime, and I'm begging the world to step in and stop this regime and bring it to a stop, bring it to its knees, so that we can free Palestine.
It's one thing to perhaps convince a nation when rockets are coming your way and you say, look, these guys are firing rockets. But how would the authorities able to sell the story of the killing of a journalist?
They don't need to sell it because nobody cares. There are no consequences. Well, they don't need to sell anything. Look, there are no sanctions. There are no investigations. The international community is silent.
I'm talking about inside Israel and Israelis watching this, and they hear that a Palestinian journalist has been killed. Do they have to justify, or the population don't care whether it's a journalist or not?
No, the public supports the Israeli government completely. I mean, these people, the Israeli government, both right, left, and center, all act with the same impunity against Palestinians, and they all have the full support of the public. When you listen, if you ever listen to the Israeli news, to the Israeli television stations, to the news programs, there is no dissent. It is only justifying what the Israeli government does. It is only excusing and justifying and explaining what the Israeli military does. There's no dissent. Nobody is standing in the midst and saying, what are we doing? Why did you kill this woman? Why are you doing this to the pallbearers? Why are you attacking the funeral procession? Israeli society is sadly, very sadly, an inherently racist society that does not care. And look, everybody's brother, cousin, brother-in-law, son-in-law are in the Secret Service, are in the intelligence services, in the police force, in the military, who engage in these crimes. So everybody feels like it's part of them. They don't feel that there's anything wrong.
This is a UN finding, and I suppose even though the UN will recognize that a crime possibly has been committed, likely has been committed, the United States veto pretty much stops it dead in its tracks.
Yes, I mean, the United Nations decisions and findings and resolutions are only as strong as their ability to enforce. If there is not and the ability to enforce, if there's not a push to impose sanctions, to impose a no-fly zone over Gaza, so Israel can, is not able to bomb the people in Gaza who live in in an open-air prison 30 minutes away from Tel Aviv, where people are celebrating every day on the beach and drinking and having a good time. If the UN can't do that, can't enforce any of this, then, it's just nothing is going to change. Like I said before, the only way this is going to change is if people respond in a way that is uncompromising. Zionism, the ideology that brought about Israel, is an apartheid ideology. It's a racist ideology. Israel, as the Amnesty International report shows very clearly, and it's less than 300 pages long. I mean, anybody can read it, and indeed people should read it. It is very, very clear. It's been an apartheid regime. It was designed as an apartheid regime, and an apartheid, as I'm sure you well know, is a crime against humanity. 3 years after the Holocaust, after World War II ended, the State of Israel was established as an apartheid regime, as a crime against humanity, against the Palestinian people. This is enormous. This report is enormously important. And again, like I said, there are recommendations both the international community, both governments and non-governmental agencies need to do. There are very specific steps that can be taken. And we have a history. And again, I'll go back to South Africa. The apartheid regime in South Africa fell. We know why. We know the steps that were taken. It was not an accident. A lot of hard work was put into it, and the same actions by the international community need to take place against the State of Israel.
Miko Peled, thank you very, very much indeed for joining us and sharing your thoughts with us on the program tonight. Thank you.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, my friend.
All right, good night.